So here we are at the third game that we're going to be examining, and this game was played between Shakhriyar Mamedyarov and Peter Svidler, two longtime 2700 plus players. I think that this is a very instructive game from this point out. And for me, one of the reasons why this is so is that both players are such high caliber players, and the position would, I think to most people, appear to be rather drawish, right? And in fact, objectively speaking, it is equal here. But the danger is for white to deal with. White is the one that, as we say, has to be careful in this position. And this is what I want to show. Well, with respect to the open files in this position or semi-open files, we can see that there are three open and semi-open files in total. The open file is here on the D file. Then this semi-open file on the E file favors black because it's white that has a pawn on the E file. And the C file is semi-open and it is favoring white. Well, this already, I think, shows us the first important point, which is that this pawn here on C6 is extremely solid. However, after white's next move, the move pawn to F4, we see that this pawn on E2 will at some point desire to advance to E4. And when it does, that is going to be a softer target than the pawn on C6. So once again, this is kind of referring back to the pros and cons of having a space advantage. With the pawn on E4, white will indeed have more central space, but on the other hand, he's more at risk of overextending and being targeted. In this case, with the reduced material on the board, we can say that the kind of shakier nature of the white position is the bigger question in play. Now, because I'm going to show why exactly the move pawn to F4 is not very good, well, let's instead offer up what would have been better. So in this position here, what would have been best is to move E4 immediately. You see, the problem that white is facing is that the black queen is a very, very well centralized piece. And on the other hand, the white queen is not only a little bit less good of a piece than the black queen, but also it's lined up here on B1. And so the combination of the well-placed queen and the somewhat vulnerable placement of the white king and queen means that black in many situations is threatening this move bishop to F5. White would like to patch that up, but at the same time he needs to worry about arranging his E and his F pawns in a way that doesn't make them vulnerable to being targeted at any given moment in a kind of a harmonious way. For example, at this moment in time, black could play such a move as queen F6 and immediately create a threat against the pawn on F2. So white wants to sort of clarify the situation here with the pawns on E2 and F2, and also watch out for such ideas as bishop F5. So the move pawn to E4 is a good move in this respect. And well, it does create some weaknesses over here. Therefore, black should continue with the move bishop G4. But after the move bishop E2, bishop takes E2, black has nothing better, queen takes E2. Now we see that having advanced this pawn on E2, white is actually doing very well here. You know, in the sense that everything is working together quite well. The queen is no longer on this diagonal, and even if it was, the good news is that there's no bishop there that might move to F5. And additionally, moves such as queen F6 are no longer a big concern. So this was certainly the way to go, and it would have led more than likely to a draw. However, Mamedyarov chose to move F4, and black stepped his queen away to H5, and now he continued with E4. And it was this overextension here that leads to trouble immediately after Svidler's next strong move, which is bishop to G4. This hits the rook, and there are maybe two kind of natural moves in this position. Mamedyarov chose to move rook E1, but let's examine instead rook D2. I think rook D2, we really want to consider it because one of the problems that Mamedyarov faced in the game, and indeed why I chose this game, is the D file. The second that white steps his rook away, as in the game, black was able to play rook a to d8, and after this, as we'll see, he never really let go of this d-file control. However, in the event of rook d2, black could have done pretty much the same thing. In this case, I've chosen the f rook to d8, and here white should continue his development with a move like bishop to c4. It's worth noting what might happen after a move such as bishop d3. Black would simply amp up the pressure with the move rook d4, rook e1, let's say, and then rook a d8. And white is just completely paralyzed here. Maybe rook e3, and now black can play c5 and start to create strong threats like c4. And this position is probably already objectively lost since white cannot untangle himself. This entire position here is very messy and black's pieces are just too active. And this pawn advance here on c4 is going to be likely too strong. So therefore, after rook to d2, rook f d8, best is bishop to c4, bishop f3 now, rook to e1 in order to defend the pawn on e4. Otherwise, let's say that we play the move like rook c1. Then after rook takes d2, we see that white cannot play queen takes d2 because the pawn on e4 is falling. So rook to e1, and now black would have the strong move queen to a5. Notice how the white position is very unstable, it's very shaky. And so black's moves have been seeking to exploit this. Remember that in the last move, white went rook e1, he needed to support e4, otherwise the queen would have been overloaded. And now in this position, white has to be very careful when moving this rook, because the rook on e1 is now being x-rayed and that's undefended. And in addition to having to worry about d2, we still need to worry about e4, as that can easily get overloaded very, very soon. So white should go with the move king c1, just to support that rook. And now black can actually target both e4 and c4 with a clever move, rook d4. The point is that if rook takes d4, queen takes e1, comes with check. Black is actually winning material here because white would have nothing better than to block. But of course that square is covered, so I can show that line. Rook takes, queen takes, and now rook d1, and we can take here on d1. And after queen takes, even the pawn on e4 is falling. Therefore, after the move king to c1, rook d4, white would have nothing better than rook e3. This is pretty much his only move. And after rook a d8, rook takes d4 would be the only move. Rook takes d4, now bishop d3. Had white been able to find this sequence of moves, then after a move like bishop to g4, we can say that black continues to be better, but perhaps it could have been held. Notice, however, how difficult it is for white to actually enter such lines, because a single mistake and you're resigning, right? So therefore, it's understandable that instead of rook d2, Mamedyarov probably saw most of these complications, rejected them, and chose rook e1. But the problem with this move is that it does indeed give up the d-file. And Svidler immediately takes that. And we can say that black now has a significant edge. His structure is more compact. He has a safer king. And he also, of course, controls the only open file in the position. This comfortably outweighs the only advantage that I can see for white here, which is a slight space advantage in the center. White now plays bishop to e2, trying to challenge this active bishop, and black simply ignores the move and plays rook d4. The black rook now invades into the white half, which is, of course, the result of controlling the open d-file, and with it comes the threat of doubling up the rooks. One of the biggest concerns for the side defending against this type of control of a file is that it can lead to an invasion along the 7th rank. And I presume most of us are familiar with the power of a rook. Once it does hit that 7th rank, it's able to create deadly threats against the enemy king and also against the base of the opponent's pawn chain. So in this case, h2, and here b2 and a2 is representing the attack against the king. Therefore, the situation is already quite grim. White continued with the move bishop takes g4. I should say that the move rook d1 was best. Challenging the rook is, of course, the most sensible thing to do. However, when you've sort of just moved to e1 recently, to then go back to d1 psychologically can be quite tricky. Black would nevertheless have played rook fd8, rook takes, and now rook e1 using tactics. The point is, the pawn on h2 cannot be captured because the bishop on g4 would be hanging. Perhaps Mamedyarov thought that in this line, in the end, the move queen takes g3 would actually create a double attack on the rook on e1 and the bishop on g4, and so this is why he rejected it. But then again, perhaps not, since the move queen e2 is not so difficult to find, and that defends both pieces. In any case, white didn't choose the move rook d1, instead played bishop takes g4. And after queen takes g4 once again, white should play rook d1. White needs to challenge that black rook as soon as possible, but instead, he chooses a move that improves his pawn structure with the move pawn to e5. I say that it's an improvement to his structure because now, this entire pawn chain is taking care of itself and white only needs to cover the base on h2. However, the problem is that this gives black a very, very important tempo, and he plays rook fd8 with it. The point is that now there is no possibility to challenge with a rook on d1 because black's control is too great. And so the threat of invasion onto d2 is very, very difficult to stop. White indeed does deal with this threat for now. He plays the move rook to e2. But now the problem is that white is completely paralyzed. And we see that although the material has been simplified and material equality remains on the board, and white has even improved his pawn structure, the one concession that white has made is that black now has full control of the d file, the only open file in the position. Notice how white's advance of these pawns has made that initial concern of having black use the semi-open e file against him, it has made that more or less a moot point. So the same can be said for the c file, where white has made absolutely no use of it and cannot make any use of it anytime soon. However, as I said, the price to pay was just too great, and we'll see what happens over the coming moves. Black plays the move g6, a useful move, and perhaps preparing to plant the king on g7 and step off the file. This, by the way, such moves are a hallmark of very strong and confident players, where Svidler understands that his advantage isn't going away anytime soon, and so he's willing to just make small improvements to his position and build up the pressure methodically. White goes rook to c1, rook to d3. From here, the black rook is not only a little bit more aggressively posted, but it's also hitting the g3 point. That can be quite useful because black may at some point play h5, h4, using the h-pawn as a battering ram against the white kingside structure. White played a3, a useful move, queen e6, and here queen c4, trying to get some more pieces off the board. Black plays rook 8 to d5. Of course, he's avoiding a queen exchange, in large part because he correctly reasons that white's king will have more problems, since black's much more active rooks can create greater threats to white's monarch. White here plays the move king to a1, and black plays a5, queen to c2, and h5. Black is slowly building up that pressure, as we mentioned. White now goes rook to f1, and b5. Mamedyarov is basically unable to contest the situation on the d file, white's rooks, because simply rook d2 will never work, rook d1 will never work, and if Mamedyarov were to try something like rook e1 in order to go on to d1, then black would use that opportunity to place the rook on the black's 7th rank or white's 2nd rank. So instead, Mamedyarov remains passive. And here, the best move is missed by Svidler. Svidler chose the move queen f5, which was a good move. However, best would have been rook 5 to d4. If white does absolutely nothing, let's say he plays rook to e2, then black will hit him with his next move and go for his setup that by now should be quite familiar from this section, and that is he would play the move queen d5, setting up Alekhine's gun. In this case, we're seeing it with the board flipped because we're actually sort of looking at it from the perspective of the player who lost. So let me just flip the board for you guys for a second. But you can see there that Alekhine's gone. We're having all of the heavy pieces on the d-file and the queen behind both rooks. And this is quite interesting to see the position from black perspective. Sometimes I tell my students to go ahead and do that. Switch perspective whenever you're working with an opening or with a middle game position or anything like that, to try and get a better feel for what it may look like from the opponent's perspective. Now let's go back to looking at it from the white side. And well, here after, let's say, a move like rook to c1, black would already play the move rook c4. And with it, he would be winning because after white retreats the queen, rook takes rook. Let's say queen to b1, rook takes rook. Queen takes rook and rook to d1 would end things. And if he doesn't go rook to c1, what else to do? If rook e to e1, rook d2 would happen. If, let's say, rook b1, then rook c4 still happens because black's pieces are so aggressively placed that the queen actually has run out of squares. You can investigate for yourselves, or you can take my word for it that this position, there is simply no move for white that is convincing. And so the move, rook to d4, setting up Alekhine's gun and completely dominating the d-file would have been really a very nice way to finish the game. Black chose to move queen f5, rook went to e1, and here c5, making further progress on the queen side. White here played e6, understandably going for counterplay. It is of course insufficient, but nevertheless it's a smart move because in chess the wisdom that desperate times ask for desperate measures does indeed hold true. However, they're not usually going to concern players of the caliber of Peter Svidler, who are more than able to diffuse such attempts at complicating a position. Svidler captures the pawn, rook f to e2, and here black plays the move rook to d6, simply defending. And in fact, this was actually a little bit of a mistake. Svidler didn't react in the most precise way. And the last thing that I want to show you in this game is that white should have gone for the move rook c1. So Mamedyarov actually missed out on a good opportunity to put pressure against another one of black's softer targets, this pawn on c5. Notice how we had identified that semi-open file in the very beginning. And here we see that finally Mamedyarov would have been able to put it to use. In fact, it's a combination of this semi-open file being put to use as well as the newly created semi-open file. Because, for example, if black now plays the move rook to d5, then we would just get a repetition after the move rook c to e1, where this point here on e6 should be defended via rook to d6, and so back again rook to c1. And if on the other hand black were to use a move such as c4, white would have options such as rook to e5, which would then target the queen as well as the pawn on b5. Nevertheless, after missing that opportunity, he chose instead the move queen to c1, and here queen d5 is played. Not quite Alekhine's gun in the sense of both rooks being behind the queen, but certainly all of the heavy pieces along the same file. And here Mamedyarov actually makes a further inaccuracy in a very difficult position. He plays the move rook to e5, and well, he takes the bait. He goes after this pawn on c5, but Svidler had foreseen this, and with his next move, queen to b3, he forces Mamedyarov's resignation because the threat is rook to d1, and with it, the queen is lost. White here actually is unable to move the queen. Let's say that white were to capture the pawn on c5, then simply rook d1, check anyway, and the king has no escape. I think it's quite a fitting end to the game that the gradual build-up of pressure on the d-file culminates with a resignation because of the rook able to enter here on the 8th rank or white's first rank, and with it, well, there's no defense against the threats against the white king. In fact, actually, it just occurred to me that I should perhaps point out that white does have the move rook 5 to e3 specifically, and then rook d1 is not possible because the queen will be hanging. And if rook takes e3 first, Then after rook takes e3, still rook d1 is not possible because the queen continues to hang. However, black can actually just sort of maintain the tension and play the move pawn to b4. And the point is that white can, if he wishes, exchange a set of rooks. But nevertheless, the white rook is tied down, controlling the d1 square. And if white here is to capture on c5, then a very beautiful checkmate arises. Rook d1, of course, white can avoid the checkmate with queen c1, but then material will be decisive. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1 instead. And after king to a2, we see one of the points behind the move b4. The pawn will march on to b3, and that is checkmate. So therefore, this is another quite nice line that illustrates the point that this move, queen to b3, is a decisive entry into the white position. I also think that one of the nice things about it is that it shows one of the advantages of all these pawn advances that Svidler was doing over the course of recent moves. Apart from this, the main takeaway from this game can and should be that even when everything appears to be more or less quite similar, I mean, if we look at the original position here, as we commented, there was quite a bit of symmetry to the position, quite a bit of symmetry to the structure specifically, and objectively speaking, it was a more or less equal position after this move e4. However, one mistake and already Mamedyarov was on the back foot, and a few moves down the line, Svidler really had a very, very dominant position once he established himself along the d-file with both rooks. That control couldn't be challenged, especially that queen positioning on g4 was problematic, and after this, even a player of Mamedyarov's caliber was unable to withstand the pressure. So I hope you enjoyed this game, I hope you found it instructive, and I shall see you in the next one.